The Nonprofit Podcast. Tools, tips, and tactics to take your organization to the next level. The Nonprofit Podcast, powered by Donorbox.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Podcast. I'm Jena, nonprofit advocate here at Donorbox. We're here each week with practical actions you can use today to increase donations and take your nonprofit to the next level tomorrow. Why people are moved to establish nonprofits to address specific social challenges is often as fascinating as how the founder and organization go about making the needed change. For Kat Calvin, founder of Spread the Vote, that moment really came to a head in 2013 midterms, followed by the heavily contested 2016 election. At a time when every vote counted, not everyone seemed to be able to vote. Kat, how did that get Spread the Vote up and running?
Good question. Before Spread the Vote, I had run another nonprofit and I'd really looked a lot at voting and voting rights in America. I had studied it in law school, but way back then, we still had a fully functioning Voting Rights Act. And so I sort of went into other fields, and then Shelby County v. Holder happened in 2013, which was a really big moment when the Supreme Court just took a huge chunk out of the Voting Rights Act. And we saw a lot of different things change, but particularly we saw voter ID laws really explode around the country. And then 2016 was the first presidential election without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And so we really saw the impact of those changes. And I had sworn I was never going to run another nonprofit. And then when the election happened, I was like, all right, I need to figure out what to do. And there were a lot of amazing organizations that were fighting voter ID laws in the courts, but it has so far proven really unsuccessful. It's really hard to get voter ID laws struck down in the courts. It's almost impossible to get state legislatures to strike them down because they're the ones that pass them. And so we were just seeing them grow and expand. And there wasn't a national org that was just helping people get IDs. I understand now why. It's wildly complicated and expensive and hard. But at the time, I'm a pretty practical person. And I was like, why don't we just get folks IDs? And then it took very little time after having that idea and starting Spread the Vote to realize that there was actually a much bigger problem, that the over 21 million American adults who don't have IDs need them to vote, sure, but they really need them for jobs and for housing and for healthcare and for beds at shelters and food at food banks. And that when we're looking at the unemployed, the unhoused, returning citizens, senior citizens, foster kids, domestic violence survivors, like all of these people who make up the most vulnerable members of our population, there was a real ID crisis. And that most of the organizations that serve those populations, were not funded to be able to get IDs and weren't trained to be able to do it and really needed help. And so we realized really quickly, this ID thing is bigger than voting. It includes voting. And you have a bunch of people who can't even really think about voting because they don't know where they're going to sleep tonight or how they're going to feed their kids. And so it's all combined. And that's really what inspired us to build Spread the Vote. And, we now call it Spread the Vote plus Project ID because we do 365 ID work. And then during elections, we do a lot of GOTV work with that same community.
So you didn't really understand what you were taking on or how many people you would ultimately end up serving?
No. So what's interesting is until I started this organization, I had no idea that there were people who didn't have IDs. I've had a passport since I was a baby. I got a military ID at 10. I got a driver's license at 16. I've literally never had a conscious moment in my life where I haven't had at least one form of government issued photo ID. We are so segregated by socioeconomic status that we don't really think about how hard it is, right? Like usually if you're in a room, you're either in a room with a bunch of people who have IDs, right? Because you're all at work or at, I was at church, wherever you are, or you're maybe in a shelter or, a food bank or something with a bunch of people who don't. But we don't spend a lot of time interacting with people who have wildly different socioeconomic statuses than us. Right. So we don't realize how big this problem is. And because this problem is really only 20 years old, this is a problem that started after 9/11 when they drastically changed how difficult it was to get DMV IDs. It's not a problem America has really caught on to yet. And plus, I started the first national ID org and national policy org just 5 years ago. So there hasn't really been anybody talking about it very much. And so I had no clue. I was more clueless than anyone who gets involved in our org, than anybody we talk to now. I had no idea. I was just like, I'm just going to give people IDs. And then every day, my team and I were like, oh my God, this is so hard. We had no idea. This issue particularly, it started as a voting issue, and then it really became and has totally become an issue of, this is actually a problem we can solve. It is a thing people desperately need.
Who do you work with mainly? Are there specific groups of people who are really challenged by the change regulations in so many states? And a bit of a loaded question, is some of this intentional?
What happened is there were certain groups that were immediately impacted. So for instance, now to get an ID, and depending on the state, sort of depends on if you need it every time or a new ID or whatever, but you need a birth certificate. Well, a lot of elderly people were born at home, right? Never got a birth certificate. A lot of elderly Black Americans were born in towns where Black children didn't get birth certificates, right? You also, speaking, of people who've never worked before, we work with the Detroit Public Schools and other school districts around the country where we have kids who, there are a lot of schools that don't give students photo student IDs. And then they go in to try to take the SAT and they can't take it. They need a job to support their families and they can't get it. So there are these, all these different groups that sort of were accidentally prevented from getting DMV IDs by these laws. There are also groups that I think we purposefully don't make it easy. So for instance, it's returning citizens, right? We work with departments of corrections and with organizations that work with returning citizens as they get out, because you can't do it. You can't get housing, you can't get a job. But this, the government's telling you have to. We have a program called Vote by Mail in Jail, because there are actually hundreds of thousands of people who are incarcerated who are eligible to vote, either because they're pretrial, because we jail people just because they can't afford to pay bail, or because they've only been convicted of misdemeanors. But other than Maine and Vermont, and there's sort of some parts of, LA and some different places, nobody really makes an effort to make sure that those incarcerated folks can vote. So we have a program now where we work with jails around the country, making it possible for incarcerated folks to vote by mail from jail. But it's all of, that is a population that the country has very specifically decided. We're not only going to make it really hard for you to get this thing, or vote or whatever, we're also going to not even tell you that it's possible. And when you, are trying to live your life on the right path, we're going to make it almost impossible for you to do so that you end up right back in jail. We do the same thing with foster kids who, as soon as they age out of the system, are just kicked out and not given any documents at all. So I could go on and on, but there's so many of our extremely vulnerable groups. And then, talking about COVID, I live in Los Angeles, where the chances of you losing your documents increase exponentially, but then the ability for you to be able to replace those things significantly decreases.
I read this quote by Naomi Klein. Democracy is not just the right to vote, it's the right to live in dignity. And that seems to be what Spread the Vote is doing, facilitating the right to live with dignity. Would you agree?
One of the things that people say to us all the time when they get an ID is, I'm a person again. It really is that fundamental. When we're talking about the valid IDs we help folks get, it's almost always a DMV ID. Okay. And basically what we do is we help folks go through the process. We have to follow all the rules of getting a DMV ID. So we just help them go through that process. And so in every state, you actually need the same types of things. The sort of what's accepted in the numbers will be a little different. So you almost always need a birth certificate, which 57% of our clients don't have. And so if you go to Vital Records and ask for a birth certificate, they'll ask for your ID. So there is always a very complicated process of having to get that. It also, can cost anywhere from $10 to $90, depending on the state. So they can be really, really expensive. But you have to get that first. In most states, you need your actual physical Social Security card, which is, even with an ID, going to the Social Security Administration is a nightmare no one should ever have to face. Without one, getting a Social Security card is really, really difficult. And so in most states, you have to do that as well. You could have, for instance, like a W-2 with your Social Security number on it. But if you are unhoused and haven't been employed in a long time, you don't have that, right? So there's a narrow set of things you can have. Those are the basic documents that you have to have. This is how you can get a birth certificate in Pennsylvania if you're unhoused and don't have ID, right? Or, this is in that state, never go to that county. They're total jerks, but we can go to state vital records and have our general counsel call them or whatever, right? But it's complicated. And it's not a thing that case managers have the capacity or the training or the funding to deal with. And certainly not something that someone who is unhoused can deal with. And $40, I work for a nonprofit. I never have $40, right? If you're unhoused, you never have that and you can't work without it. And so it ends up being this wildly complicated and really impossible task, to the point where we've had folks who for 20, 30 or 40 years haven't had an ID because they could never overcome those hurdles, even pre 9/11. When it wasn't as hard, but there were still things they just couldn't get. And then you just get stuck. And once you're stuck, it's very difficult in this country to become unstuck.
So I want to time travel for a second. I want to go way back 5 years ago or something like that. When, what, and where was the first campaign that you undertook with Spread the Vote?
Actually, I started Spread the Vote with a tweet. I have it framed here. In December of 2016.
Can you read that tweet?
I can. So it was December 20th, 2016. And I said, if anyone is interested in working on a project to help people get state ID so they can vote, DM me. And a ton of people DM'd me. And so I kept sneaking out of my office and having phone calls with all of these people who wanted to volunteer. And the first thing that we did was start researching the issue. So I had started researching and realizing okay, one of the big things that I always tell people when they're thinking about starting a nonprofit is, first of all, don't. It's so hard. Just be rich and donate. But if you're going to, first look and see, is there anyone else who is doing this work? Because oftentimes there will be. And if they are, and it's, an org that's doing the work, and that, seems to be making an impact, volunteer with them, work with them, go do that. But there are a lot of issues in the world. And so there may be nobody who's really addressing the work, or nobody who's, perhaps addressing it in a way that your research and expertise has shown you might be the way to solve it or whatever. The first thing we did was start researching and talking to experts who had worked on voter ID issues at the Brennan Center, the ACLU, everywhere. And they were amazing. They were totally generous with their time. This random girl no one had ever heard of was calling. And we started to work on, what would the best process for this be? And we come up with an idea, we write out a plan, and then we'd go to the experts and they'd be like, here's 85 reasons that's not going to work. Then we'd be like, all right. And then we'd revise and we'd go and they'd be like, yeah, people tried that. Here's all the reasons it failed. And we kept revising and kept talking until we came up with a plan that the experts were like, actually, no one's tried that yet. That feels like it might work. And we were like, great, we're trying this. And so then we went and we launched our first chapter in Atlanta, Georgia. And that was the first time that, I went to Atlanta and trained volunteers, which was hilarious because I didn't know what I was doing. But I was like, here's how we think this will work. And we went around and tried to get IDs and totally didn't work for a million reasons. And then we learned from those mistakes and then went to Virginia and succeeded there and then figured out okay, this is how this can work. And then sort of started building out from there.
What can you share about the startup experience that helped to keep you focused? Do you have any advice on who to talk to or where to get that first program up and running?
So there's a book called The Lean Startup. So you got to do a little bit of research. Don't just drop off a cliff. Figure out what it is you want to do. figure out what you think maybe the best first step is. But what I told my team when we launched was like, look, this is version 1.0 of what's going to be like version 22.0 before we figure it out. And then you got to get into the community, because that is how you're going to figure out if you're right. We went into the community in Atlanta and totally failed and figured out all of the things that we were wrong, all the assumptions we made that were wrong, figured out the whole, oh, wait, IDs are not about voting. People need IDs for lives. And so we can't go talk to someone who's unhoused about voting when they can't eat, right? Like, we had to be on the streets to figure that out. And then we could step back and revise and say, okay, we're going to try again. But it's so important to have a good balance of, I want to do some research and not just leap out blindly, but I also cannot spend the next 15 years researching something, because then I'm going to put something out and I'm going to have to put so much time and money into it. And it's going to be completely wrong because I don't have any information from the street.
So how much of what you do leans on the support of volunteers? So do you have a formal volunteer program now? And what do these people do? What is it geared towards?
Yeah, so early on, we were heavily reliant on volunteers because we didn't have any money. I was sleeping on people's couches. We didn't have staff or anything. And so volunteers were everything. They helped us. There were the volunteers who jumped in right away and helped build the organization, helped do research, helped do the legal things, like all of that, helped build the website. And then there were the volunteers who built our first chapters and got our first IDs and like really started to do all of that. And so they are like, this organization would not exist without volunteers. I mean, I was essentially a volunteer at first, right? But like without people coming in and being willing to put in a significant amount of time and energy and effort, like none of this would have happened. I think that one really important thing about your volunteer program is that it's going to change a lot, especially when you're living in an apocalypse and times are changing, or you just need different things, as you grow and you grow out of startup phase into like actual sustainable organization phase, and the types of people who you need volunteering for different things change, what you need on the ground changes, and being able to shift and recognize like, oh, we're in a new phase now. So what we need from folks changes. It really helps make sure that you're using volunteers in a way that is actually impactful, that makes them feel like they're being impactful. Being able to shift and find different ways to help people make an impact and help us, push our programs and our mission forward has been really, really helpful.
What's your volunteer retention turnover rate? This isn't easy work, right?
The ID work is really hard. And so you end up with, and we have an online volunteer training program. You have to go through 3 different online courses to be able to get IDs with us. And part of that is because you need to know the laws and, the rules and how we do it, et cetera. But part of it is because it really weeds out a lot of folks for whom this is not the role. One thing I think too is important when you're running a volunteer program is to know not everybody is right for your program. I've had to volunteers go because they were wildly racist. It's just like, you can't be a part of our program, right? And so when we were first starting out, we had all these people volunteering, and we were just throwing them into chapters, and then we were losing most of them. And it was because they had no idea what they were signing up for. They didn't realize how hard it was. They didn't realize the time it takes. It takes an average of 3 to 4 weeks to get an ID. It's really tough. And so once we implemented this educational system and said, all right, you've got to do these 3 things, but then you'll be like spread the vote certified and you can get an ID and whatever. The number of people who don't make the program is really high, but the number of people who stay on and volunteer after they've graduated is much higher than it was when we were just shooting people out.
There's a weariness in the voting population. Are you seeing that among donors? Is there an appetite to fund your work?
Because A, IDs are an issue that really touch so many different demographics, and B, because it's very practical. One thing that I always tell people when they're fundraising is you've got to find a practical impact. We can tell people an average of $40 will help someone get an ID. Period. That's how it works. I can send you a picture with that person and their ID in the DMV, right? It's very practical. And, that's where, and, this is how, I'll plug Donorbox. We have a monthly donor program that we use Donorbox for. And we've built, it's called Hamer's Heroes after Fannie Lou Hamer. And, they get a t-shirt and, this and that, but really people give monthly because they know like, okay, I can't write a check for $1,000, but if I give $30 a month, or $40 a month, that I am contributing one ID a month. And I know that, and that is something that I can do. And it is something that I care enough about that I want to do it. And it's easy. It just comes out of my account, right? But people need to understand those specifics, and they need stories. One other benefit, and I think one thing that really helps us is that we've got nothing but stories, right? We've just got thousands and thousands and thousands of people with pictures and stories about, this is why I don't have an ID and this is how it's going to change my life. And here's a picture of me at the DMV with an ID. And maybe if we're lucky, we'll get a video of them talking, and that for donors really matters because it makes it real. Like I'm a data and stats person. I just want to see a spreadsheet, but most people, they really do want those stories. And, people say it all of the time in fundraising, but it's when you start doing it, you really get like, that is what gets people is, oh, this is a picture of a mom and 6 of her 8 kids. They all came to the DMV. She needed an ID because she needed to get them housing that had running water in it. That is something that is very difficult for any donor to say no to, right? Mm-hmm. Having those really important stories helps. The other thing too is I ask a lot of, my friends who are running organizations that, are getting donations from foundations that I'd like to talk to, or who are just, being really successful in fundraising. And I would just say like, how did you do that? Or do you know anyone? And, I think that we have this whole scarcity mentality in nonprofits and we really, think we're competing, but we don't have to be. And look, these donors have enough money to give to all of us. They have too much money. That's actually the whole problem. The whole reason that our nonprofits exist is because they have too much money. And so, if you're, there will be people who won't share, right? And who don't want to, but a lot of people will. And a lot of people did. And I try now to pay it forward and to send as many introductions as I can to foundations and things like that. Because we're all try to make the world a better place in our own particular way. And, even if it's me and other voting rights orgs, foundations can give to more than one voting rights org, so why not share and have us all build and work together? And sometimes we say like, oh, you know what, if we create a partnership, we can go to this funder and say that we're partnering on this and we may be more likely to get funded and actually be able to do this project that can make an impact. So I think that, I always talk to nonprofit folks who are afraid to ask other people in their space. And I'm always like, ask. I mean, first of all, the worst thing that can happen is they say no, or do a trade and say, hey, you were funded by X, I was funded by X. Do we want, make an intro and I'll make an intro and then we can both, try to grow together. And I think, using each other as a resource is really important. And it's a thing that people miss a lot.
Kat, we could talk all day, but we're out of time. Do you have a last thought to share?
We've got to be willing to talk about it more with each other. I know you don't want to talk about it publicly, but look, all of these donors, they made their money. They understand how money works. They understand how hard times work. And when I reached out to donors, a lot of them were like, we have emergency grants. Like we have provisions for this. You just have to be willing to open up and to talk about it. And we've got to share more because this whole sort of competitive, cutthroat nonprofit spirit is not good for anybody.
Talking to Kat is truly an eye and mind-opening experience. I have a huge personal interest in volunteer management and training, and I have to echo her advice when it comes to recruiting, awareness, and training and the always present retention issue. I'm also really keen on finding new ways to approach funders. And if, like me, you would like to hear more from Kat on how to approach a shared funding application with other nonprofits, please reach out. You can find us at podcast@donorbox.org. And we can have another session with Kat to drill down on the concept and explore how Spread the Vote has made this truly millennial approach work for them. Thank you for choosing to spend time with the Nonprofit Podcast today. I hope you've left with the confidence to take a small step today that will make a big difference tomorrow. Don't forget to download and review the podcast today, or give it a thumbs up if you're listening to the Nonprofit Podcast on YouTube. Your review is a great way to help others find us. You're here to help others. We're here to help you. Until next time, stay inspired.
The Nonprofit Podcast, powered by Donorbox, helping you help others.